The rent was $420 a month. No deposit, no application, no questions. At the time, it felt like the best deal I'd ever found. 3 neighbors tried to convince me not to spend the night there. I thought they were being dramatic. I was wrong. The rent was $420 a month. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. I'd been looking for a place for 6 weeks by then. Early spring, 2019. I was relocating for a contract surveying job in Hardin County, about 40 minutes south of Elizabethtown, Kentucky. The kind of area where the towns thin out and the county roads stretch long between feed stores and Baptist churches. I didn't need much. A roof, a bed, somewhere to set up my laptop and eat dinner. But everything I found was either too far from the work site, too expensive for what it was, or already taken by someone who'd been on the waiting list since February. Then I found the listing. It was on one of those regional rental sites that looks like it hasn't been redesigned since 2006. One photo, a plain, single-story house with white siding and a flat yard. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen. Built in the early 70s. The listing said, available immediately, month-to-month lease, no deposit required, $420 a month, utilities included. I called the number. The landlord was a man named Gerald Fitch, older voice, clipped and direct. He confirmed the price, said I could move in that weekend if I wanted, and asked only 2 questions, whether I had a job and whether I planned to bring animals. I said yes to the first and no to the second. He said he'd leave the key under a brick by the side door. That was it. No credit check, no application, no references. I figured there was a catch. A mold problem, bad plumbing, maybe structural damage. But I drove out on a Saturday morning to look at it, and the house was fine, more than fine. The floors were solid, the windows sealed properly. The kitchen had been updated at some point in the last decade. It smelled like pine cleaner and old wood. The yard was mowed. There was even a clothesline in the back with aluminum poles. I stood in the living room and tried to find the problem. I checked the outlets, ran the water, flushed the toilet, opened the closets. Nothing. It was a clean, simple, functional house in a quiet area, priced at less than half of what anything comparable would cost. I moved in that afternoon. The house sat at the end of a short gravel lane called Tabor Road, about a quarter mile off the main county route. There were 3 other houses visible from the front porch, one directly across the road, one a few hundred feet to the east, and one just barely in view through a line of hackberry trees to the west. Behind the house was open pasture land that ran flat and treeless for about a mile before hitting a wooded ridge. The nearest gas station was a 12-minute drive, the nearest grocery store about 20. It was quiet, not peaceful quiet, just quiet, the kind where you notice the absence of sound more than the presence of it. I spent that first day unpacking. 2 duffel bags, a box of kitchen supplies, a sleeping bag I planned to use until I bought a mattress. I set up my laptop on the kitchen counter and made coffee in a French press I'd brought from my last apartment. By the time the sun was going down, I was sitting on the front porch with a mug in my hand, watching the sky turn copper above the ridgeline. That's when I met the first neighbor. She came from the house to the east, walking along the gravel shoulder with a small terrier on a leash. She was maybe 60, short gray hair, wearing a quilted vest over a flannel shirt. She stopped at the edge of my yard and looked at me like she was confirming something she already suspected. I waved. She didn't wave back right away. She just looked at the house behind me, then at me, then at the house again. "You moving in?" she asked. "Already did," I said. She nodded slowly. The dog sniffed the edge of the gravel and pulled at the leash, but she didn't move. "You planning to stay here nights?" I didn't understand the question at first. I thought maybe she was asking if this was a weekend place, or if I'd be commuting from somewhere else. I told her I was working in the area, and this was my full-time rental. She looked at the house one more time. Then she said, very quietly, almost like she was talking to herself, "Well, I hope it goes all right for you." and she turned and walked back the way she came. I watched her disappear behind the trees before turning back toward the house. That's when I noticed the front door was slightly open. I was almost certain I'd closed it. I stood there for several seconds trying to remember whether I'd actually locked it before sitting on the porch. Eventually, I convinced myself the wind must have caught it. The strange part was, there hadn't been any wind all afternoon. I didn't think much of it. Country people are like that sometimes. Guarded, careful with strangers. I finished my coffee, went inside, and fell asleep on the living room floor, with the sleeping bag zipped up to my chest. Nothing happened that first night. I want to be clear about that. I slept straight through until my alarm went off at 5:30. I got up, made coffee, drove to the job site, and worked a 10-hour shift walking property lines with a GPS unit and a 50-pound pack. When I came home, I was too tired to notice much of anything. I ate, I showered, I slept. The second night was the same, and the third. It was Thursday, 4 days after I moved in, when things started to feel different. I got home around 6:30. The sun was still up, but low, casting long shadows across the pasture behind the house. I made dinner, canned soup and toast, and sat at the kitchen table looking out the back window. The field was empty. The ridge in the distance was dark green, almost black. The sky above it was going from blue to that pale, bruised grey you get right before full dark. I finished eating and washed the bowl. I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room. And that's when I noticed it. The house was cold. What bothered me wasn't the temperature, it was the silence. The refrigerator was still running. The clock in the kitchen was still ticking. But the hallway somehow felt quieter than the rest of the house. Not naturally quieter. Like sound itself didn't stay there for very long. Not cold like the heat had gone out. Cold like one part of the house was a different temperature than the rest. I was standing in the hallway between the living room and the back bedroom, and the air there was maybe 10 degrees cooler than it had been in the kitchen. I put my hand against the wall. The drywall was cold too. Not damp, just cold, like the wall had been exposed to night air for hours, even though it was an interior wall with no windows. I checked the vents. They were closed. I checked the back bedroom. Normal temperature. I went back to the hallway and the cold was still there. A pocket of it. Defined, almost. Like it had edges. I told myself it was an insulation gap. Old houses have them. Air gets trapped between walls, follows paths it shouldn't. I'd seen it in plenty of structures during survey work. I made a mental note to mention it to Gerald if it persisted and went to bed. But I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of the cold, because of the sound. It started around 1 in the morning. A low, rhythmic tapping. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady, coming from somewhere in the back of the house. I lay there in the dark and listened to it. Tap, tap, tap. Even intervals, maybe 2 seconds apart. It didn't speed up. It didn't stop. It just continued, patient and unhurried, like a finger against a tabletop. I got up and walked through the house. The sound was louder in the hallway, right in that cold spot. But when I stood still and listened, it seemed to move. Not in a direction exactly, more like it was shifting in depth. Sometimes it sounded like it was inside the wall. Sometimes it sounded like it was behind me. And once, just once, it sounded like it was directly beneath the floor. I checked the crawl space access panel in the back bedroom closet. I opened it and shined my phone flashlight into the gap. Concrete slab, PVC piping, dust, nothing moving. No animal, no drip, no mechanical source. The tapping stopped while I was looking. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until my alarm went off. The next morning, I saw the man from the house across the road. He was standing at his mailbox when I pulled out of the gravel lane. I stopped the truck and rolled down the window. He was older than the woman, maybe 70. Thin, clean-shaven, wearing a corduroy jacket even though it was already warm out. I told him I'd moved into the house across the way. He nodded. He said his name was Dale. I asked him if he knew anything about the house's history. whether it had had problems with insulation or settling, anything structural. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "How long you been staying there at night?" That question again, specific, pointed. Not how long have you lived there, but how long have you been staying there at night? I said about a week. He scratched the back of his neck and looked past me at the house. "You hear anything yet?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say no. I wanted to treat it like a normal question about a noisy pipe or a raccoon in the attic. But something in his face told me he already knew the answer. I said I'd heard some tapping. He nodded like I'd confirmed a diagnosis. "It gets worse," he said. And then, quieter, "You shouldn't stay after dark." He turned and walked back up his driveway before I could ask anything else. I drove to work that morning with the radio off, replaying the conversation. Two neighbors, two versions of the same warning. Both of them focused on nighttime. Both of them treating my presence in the house as something temporary, something that wouldn't last. I wanted to be rational about it. I was a surveyor. I worked with data, measurements, verifiable facts. I didn't believe in haunted houses. I didn't believe in much of anything I couldn't observe and document. And I told myself that whatever was happening, the cold spot, the tapping, had a physical explanation I just hadn't found yet. So I stayed. Friday night, the tapping came back. Same time. The tapping stopped halfway through. The silence that followed felt almost comforting. Then, one slow knock came from the bedroom door behind me. Just one. Nothing after that. I recorded it on my phone. When I played it back, the recording was almost silent. A faint, distant clicking, barely audible over the ambient hiss of the room. It sounded nothing like what I'd heard standing in the hallway. Saturday night, I set up my laptop in the hallway and left the microphone recording all night. 8 hours. When I reviewed the file the next morning, there was nothing. No tapping, no anomalous sound, just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. But I had heard it, both nights, clear and present and rhythmic. That Sunday, I drove into town and sat in a diner for an hour, eating breakfast and thinking. When I came back, the woman with the terrier was walking past again. This time she stopped without me waving. "You're still there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm still there." She looked down at the dog, then back at me. "The last person lasted 11 days. I asked her what she meant. "Before you, the last person who rented that house. He lasted 11 days before he left. Didn't even take his furniture. Gerald had to send someone to clear it out." I asked what made him leave. She shook her head. "He didn't say. None of them do. They just go." I asked how many there had been. "Since I've lived here, 7, maybe 8. Nobody stays. Not once the nights start." She looked at me the way you look at someone standing too close to a ledge. Not frightened for herself, frightened for me. "It's not my business," she said. "But you seem like a sensible person, and sensible people don't stay in that house." She walked away. I went inside and sat on the living room floor and tried to think clearly. 7 or 8 tenants, none of them staying. A landlord who charged almost nothing and asked no questions. A house that was structurally sound, but that nobody wanted. That night, I decided to stay awake. I sat in a folding chair in the hallway with a flashlight, a notebook, and my phone. I turned off every light in the house. I left the curtains open so the moonlight came through the front windows. I waited. For the first 3 hours, nothing. The house was silent. The temperature in the hallway was normal. I could hear crickets through the walls, a dog barking somewhere far off, the occasional pass of a car on the county road. Then, at 12:47, I checked my phone. The cold came back. It didn't creep in. It arrived. One moment the air was room temperature, and the next it was cold enough that I could see the faintest trace of my breath in the flashlight beam. I stood up and moved through the hallway. The cold was concentrated in a space about 4 feet wide, right between the 2 bedroom doors. It didn't extend into either room. It stayed in the hall, like something standing there. I wrote down the time and the temperature estimate. I took a photo of the hallway, just a dark corridor, nothing visible. The tapping started at 1:02. Same rhythm, same spacing, but this time it was louder. Not dramatically, maybe 20% more. Enough that I could feel it in my chest slightly, the way you feel a bass note from a speaker in the next room. And this time it had a quality I hadn't noticed before, a wetness. Not like dripping water, more like the sound a knuckle makes on wood when the skin is damp. I stood in the cold spot and listened. The tapping was coming from the wall to my left, the wall that separated the hallway from the second bedroom. I put my ear against it, and I heard breathing. Not mine, not an echo of mine, someone else's. Slow, shallow, measured breathing, just on the other side of the drywall. I held my own breath and listened. It continued. In, out, not labored, not panicked, calm. Like someone sleeping, or like someone standing very still, very close, with their face near the wall. I stepped back. My heart was going fast, but I didn't run. I made myself walk to the second bedroom and open the door. I shined the flashlight inside, empty. The closet was open. Nothing in it. No one in the room. The window was closed and locked from the inside. I went back to the hallway. The breathing had stopped. The tapping had stopped. The cold was already fading, the air warming around me like a pocket of winter dissolving into spring. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on until the sun came up. That afternoon, while looking for a screwdriver in one of the kitchen drawers, I found an old utility bill folded beneath the drawer liner. The paper had yellowed around the edges. The name printed across the top was Maura Kinney. Until then, I'd never heard that name. Monday morning, I called Gerald Fitch. I didn't mention the sounds or the cold. I asked him about the house's history. He said he'd bought it in 2004 from the county. I asked what that meant. He said it had been in a tax default. The previous owner had stopped paying, and eventually the county seized it and auctioned it off. He got it cheap. I asked who the previous owner was. He paused. Then he said, "A woman named Maura Kinney. She passed." I asked how. Another pause. Longer this time. "That's not really relevant to the rental agreement." I told him I was just curious. He said the house had been empty for a while before he bought it, and he'd had it renovated before putting it on the market. He asked if there was a problem with the property. I said no. He said to call if I needed anything and hung up. That afternoon, instead of going straight home from work, I drove to the Hardin County Public Library. It was a small building off the main road in Elizabethtown, with a local history section in the back corner. I asked the librarian if they had any records or news archives I could search. She pointed me to a microfiche machine and a set of binders with clippings from the Hardin County section of the News Enterprise. I searched for the name Maura Kinney. It took almost an hour. The system was old and slow, and the indexing was inconsistent, but I found it. A small article from October 2001, buried on page 6. Maura Kinney, age 44, had been found deceased in her home on Tabor Road. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the article noted that she had been discovered by a mail carrier who noticed a smell. The estimated time between death and discovery was 11 days. 11 days. The same number the neighbor had mentioned. The last tenant who left, he lasted 11 days. I sat in the library and read the article 3 more times. It was short, factual. It said she had lived alone. No surviving family was mentioned. The house had been left unoccupied after her death, eventually falling into tax default. I searched for more. There wasn't much. One follow-up article, 2 weeks later, mentioned that the county coroner had revised the timeline. Maura Kinney had likely died in late September, not early October. She had been dead in the house for closer to 3 weeks before anyone found her. The article mentioned that neighbors had noticed a smell, but assumed it was an animal carcass in the field. 3 weeks, alone, in that house. I closed the binder and sat there for a while. When I drove home that evening, the house looked different, not physically. It was the same white siding, the same flat yard, the same gravel lane. but I couldn't stop thinking about her. Maura Kinney, 44 years old, dying alone in that hallway, or that bedroom, or that kitchen, and lying there for 3 weeks while the neighbors smelled something and looked the other way. I went inside. I stood in the hallway. The cold spot wasn't there. The house was warm and quiet and still, but I could feel it. Not a presence exactly, more like an impression. The weight of someone having been in a space for too long, leaving something behind that isn't a ghost, but isn't nothing either. I cooked dinner. I ate it standing at the counter because I didn't want to sit down. I washed the plate and put it in the drying rack and stood by the back window looking at the field. The sun went down. I told myself I was going to stay. I told myself there was nothing in the house that could hurt me. I told myself that tapping was pipes. The cold was insulation. The breathing was wind moving through gaps I couldn't see. I told myself all of it. At 11:15, I turned off the lights and lay down on the sleeping bag in the living room. At 12:30, the cold came. It rolled through the hallway and into the living room this time, not confined to one spot, spreading. I could feel it moving across the floor like water, cold air sliding under the sleeping bag, touching my ankles, my wrists, the back of my neck. The temperature in the room dropped steadily over maybe 2 minutes, and then it held. The tapping started, closer now, not in the hallway, in the living room wall, the one behind my head. Same rhythm, same spacing, but heavier. Each tap resonated through the drywall and into the floor, a vibration I could feel through the sleeping bag. And then the new thing, a smell. Faint at first, then stronger, sweet and thick and wrong. Not rot, exactly, more like the memory of rot. Like the chemical ghost of something organic that had been in a closed space too long. It came in waves, there for a few seconds, then gone, then back, stronger. I sat up. The room was dark. The moonlight through the front windows threw pale rectangles on the floor. The air was cold and still, and that smell was everywhere now, filling my nose, coating the back of my throat. And in the hallway, I could see the hallway from where I was sitting. There was a shadow. Not a shape, not a figure, a shadow. A place where the darkness was darker than it should have been. It didn't move. It didn't flicker. It was just there, standing in the hallway between the 2 bedroom doors, occupying the exact space where the cold always started. I looked at it. It held still. The tapping continued. The smell continued. And I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The sudden, unwelcome understanding that this was not random, that this was a pattern, and the pattern had a source, and the source had been here long before me. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I got up slowly, walked to the front door, opened it, stepped outside, and sat on the porch. The night air was warm, normal. The crickets were loud, the stars were bright. Behind me, the house was silent. I sat there until dawn. When the sun came up, I went back inside. The hallway was empty. The air was warm. No smell, no cold, no shadow. The house was just a house again. Clean, simple, functional, and wrong. I packed my things that morning. It took less than an hour. I loaded the truck and sat in the cab for a few minutes, looking at the house. Dale was at his mailbox again when I pulled out. He watched me turn onto the county road. He didn't wave. He didn't say anything. He just watched me go, with an expression that might have been relief. I drove 20 minutes to a motel near Elizabethtown and checked in. That night, I slept for 11 hours straight. No cold, no tapping, no smell, no breathing on the other side of a wall that had no one behind it. I called Gerald the next morning and told him I was terminating the lease. He didn't ask why. He didn't seem surprised. He just said he'd send someone by for the key and asked me to leave it under the same brick where I'd found it. I drove back one last time to drop off the key. When I pulled up, the woman with the terrier was walking past. She stopped. "You're leaving," she said. "I'm leaving." She nodded. She looked at the house, the way you look at something you've learned to live next to, but never accept. "Maura was a nice woman," she said. Quiet, almost a whisper. She kept to herself, had her troubles. Nobody checked on her, and we should have. She paused. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to be somewhere and have nobody come, to call out and have nobody hear. I think maybe a thing like that doesn't just go away when a person does. She looked at me one last time. I'm sorry you had to feel it. She walked away with the dog at her heels, and I put the key under the brick, and I left Tabor Road for the last time. I finished the surveying contract from the motel, 8 more weeks. I never drove past the house again, though I could have. The county road ran within a mile of it. I didn't want to see it, not because I was afraid, because I understood something about it now, and understanding didn't make it better, it made it worse. Maura Kinney died alone in that house. She lay there for 3 weeks while the people who lived closest to her smelled something and assumed it was a dead animal in the field. And when the house was finally emptied and cleaned and sold and rented and re-rented, something stayed. Not her, maybe. Not her ghost, but the shape of what happened to her. The cold, the stillness, the sound of someone tapping on a wall that no one ever came to answer. I don't know what it was. I don't need to know. Some things don't resolve. Some places hold on to what happened in them, the way soil holds on to rain, invisibly, completely, for longer than anyone expects. The listing is still up. I checked, once, about a year later. Same photo, same price, same terms. I thought that was the end of it. I finished my surveying contract. I moved back home. I stopped thinking about Tabor Road. Or at least, I tried to. About 6 months later, I received an email from someone I didn't recognize. There was no message, just one attachment, a scanned newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, "Another tenant leaves Tabor Road property after 11 days." I stared at it for several minutes, because Maura Kinney didn't buy that house until 1994, which meant the 11-day pattern had already existed years before she ever lived there. I don't know who sent the article. I don't know how they got my email, but I spent the rest of that night reading everything I could find about that property. And what I discovered next made the house itself seem like the least frightening part of the story. Nobody's staying. That was today's case. But the story of Tabor Road isn't over. Part 2 is coming very soon, and I don't think you'll have to wait long. If you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe to Midnight Files and turn on notifications. And before you go, tell me your theory in the comments. Why did every tenant leave after exactly 11 days? Until next time, good night, and stay out of the dark.